Good afternoon and welcome to our study of Hebrews chapter 11. One of the most inspirational chapters in the whole of the book, maybe in the whole of the New Testament. So having spent 10 chapters making the case for Jesus to be the rightful object of our faith and exhorting believers to press into that life of faith, the writer to the Hebrews now seeks to expand upon what it means to live faithfully. First by defining faith, and then by placing before us a kind of faith-filled believer's hall of fame, which is definitely intended to encourage and inspire us and not to intimidate us. Anyway, we're going to unpack the chapter in what I hope will be easily digestible bite-sized pieces. So here goes. Hebrews 11 verses 1 through 7. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Indeed, by faith our ancestors received approval. By faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was made from things that are not visible. By faith Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain's. Through this he received approval as righteous, God himself giving approval to his gifts. He died, but through his faith he still speaks. By faith Enoch was taken, so that he did not experience death, and he was not found because God had taken him. For it was attested before he was taken away that he had pleased God. And without faith it is impossible to please God. For whoever would approach him must believe that he exists, and that he rewards those who seek him. By faith Noah, warned by God about the events as yet unseen, respected the warning, and built an ark to save his household. By this he condemned the world, and became an heir to the righteousness that is in accordance with faith. So, from the earliest times, as far as God's people were concerned, faith and hope were always connected. And our author defines their connection in our opening verse. And N.T. Wright says it this way: faith is looking at God and trusting him for everything, while hope is looking at the future and trusting God for it. And we'll come back to that quote a little later on. You see, I can have hope for a new and perfect, fully embodied life beyond death. But that hope has little or no substance at all. In fact, it comes down to nothing more than optimism, unless I believe in the actual life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Now, as the author rehearses some of the lives of the early people of faith, it's not so that we might view them as being perfect people whose perfection somehow earned them credit with God. Far from it. What we discover is a people just as flawed as you and me in so many ways, and yet underlying those perfections were faith characteristics named as assurance and conviction. Now, before taking us through a who's who of the Old Testament, the writer to the Hebrews in verse 3 takes us all the way back to Genesis 1, which is done earlier in the book. And he reminds us that God, out of a heart overflowing with love, spoke into being the dawn of creation, thus setting creation itself on a trajectory that was always intended to reach its climax in the person of Jesus Christ. And with that as a vital, fixed starting point, the writer moves us forward. The first two characters he mentions are Abel and Enoch, which strikes me as somewhat interesting because we know very little of their stories other than Abel was the first recorded murder victim in the Bible, and Enoch was mysteriously gathered into heaven before he succumbed to death. So how do these two particular characters personify a life of faith? Why are they mentioned immediately after the writer to the Hebrews has given us a definition of faith and connected it to hope? Well, in the case of Abel, we know that he was the brother of Cain, and they were the sons of Adam and Eve. Abel was a shepherd, and Cain a farmer. As we read their story in Genesis chapter 4, we discover that Abel brought the choicest animals of the flock to sacrifice in honor of God, while we're told that Cain brought simply an offering. The implication here is that Abel realized that the very best of the flock was the least he could bring, acknowledging that the flock itself was a gift from God, while Cain seemingly grudgingly brings some of the produce of the land with an apparent "if I must" attitude. You see, by these two very acts, the men's hearts were exposed. Abel's, a heart full of humble gratitude. Cain's, on the other hand, displaying grudging indifference, which is why God found Cain's offering unacceptable. And the very real darkness that was in Cain's heart was soon revealed as his jealous anger drove him to murder his brother. So you could rightfully say that Abel's act of faith cost him his life, yet that faith lived out would be rewarded on the other side of death. Enoch is one of the most intriguing characters in the whole Bible, I guess. The writer to the Hebrews echoes what little we know of Enoch from Genesis chapter 5 and verse 24, that he was a man who walked with God, that God was pleased with him, and that God took him. Now the point being made here is that it's our action of walking with God, faith being exercised, that matters. That's why Abel and Enoch receive specific mention immediately after our author has provided a definition of faith, and before he introduces the patriarchs with whom we're probably more familiar. Now Noah was a man who exercised his faith in a most practical and very public way, constructing an ark purely because the Lord warned him of the flood that was to come. Genesis chapter 6 and verse 9 describes Noah in exactly the same way Enoch was characterized, a man who walked with God. You see, in Noah's case, although having no personal experience of what a flood actually was, he set about building an ark. It was a project which took years, and throughout that time Noah was ridiculed and vilified by all around him, and yet he remained faithful to God. Noah didn't cave in to the pressures exerted by the world, and so he served as a living indictment of that world, which Genesis tells us was populated by a people consumed by evil. Now, on to the next few verses. We'll read Hebrews 11, 8 through 12. By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out for a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he set out, not knowing where he was going. By faith he stayed for a time in the land he had been promised, as in a foreign land, living in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith he received power of procreation, even though he was too old, and Sarah herself was barren, because he considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one person, and this one as good as dead, descendants were born, as many as the stars of heaven, and as innumerable as grains of sand by the seashore. In this passage, our attention is drawn to the faith of Abraham and Sarah. Yet more importantly, our attention is drawn to our God of covenant, one who is literally as good as his word. The passage begins by reminding us of Abraham's literal steps of faith, when as a 75-year-old man, living in the comfort of his father's land, the Lord asks him to up sticks and move to a new country, whose location had yet to be revealed, because God has plans to make Abraham and Sarah the patriarch and matriarch of a people as innumerable as the stars of heaven or the sands of the seashore. And how does Abraham respond? With limited information, over and above focusing on the inconvenience of moving from a life of relative comfort and the dubious likelihood of becoming parents in old age, Abraham responds in a way that displays his absolute trust in the God of covenant, the God of promise. Abraham personifies in this instance those words penned by N.T. Wright that I referred to earlier. Faith is looking at God and trusting him for everything, while hope is looking at the future and trusting God for it. And I think we need to bear that refrain in mind as we continue through our study of this chapter. We're going to read verses 13 through 22. All of these died in faith without having received the promises, but from a distance they saw and greeted them. They confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on the earth. For people who speak in this way make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land that they had left behind, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, he has prepared a city for them. By faith, Abraham, when put to the test, offered up Isaac. He who had received the promises was ready to offer up his only son, of whom he had been told, "It is through Isaac that descendants shall be named for you." He considered the fact that God is able even to raise someone from the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. By faith, Isaac invoked blessings for the future on Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave instructions about his burial. There is so many characters here. We think about Isaac and Jacob and Esau and Joseph, and we just don't have time to do an in-depth study on each one of those. So I'm going to park for a little bit on the faith of Sarah and Abraham. And as we do so, I think it worthwhile to keep two things in particular in mind. First, neither Abraham nor Sarah is being lauded as a perfect person who never had a moment's hesitation or doubt about their faith walk. We only have to recall Abraham trying to pass his wife off as his sister on 2 occasions to save his own skin. And then consider the events surrounding the birth of Ishmael, to understand that we're not talking about perfect people here. You see, that's really important for you and me to remember. Faith is not about perfect people. It's about flawed people looking to a perfect God. I'm going to say that again. Faith is not about perfect people. It's about flawed people looking to a perfect God. The second thing to remember, and I don't know if you've thought about this before, although the promise that Sarah would indeed conceive a son in the person of Isaac, that promise was fulfilled. We should also remember that Abraham and his immediate family never came to actually possess for themselves the land which God had promised. Indeed, they remained nomads, living on the promise of God. In fact, the only piece of property that was officially Abraham's was the cave he bought from the Hittites, which would serve to be the family burial plot. And you can read about that in Genesis 23. So what about the promise of the land? Well, back in verse 10, we were told that Abraham had his eyes set on a city whose architect was God himself. This is echoed in verse 16 as the heavenly country, and is referred to again on multiple occasions later on in the letter. So what does the writer have in mind, I wonder? Jerusalem would of course become the cultural and political center of Israel, the promised land. But even Jerusalem, with the temple as its focal point, was simply a very important signpost to an even greater reality. The reality of that day when heaven and earth will for all time come together, with the new Jerusalem described in Revelation 21 and 22 as the eternal focal point, with the Lord and his people dwelling together. In a way that's somewhat mysterious to me and possibly to you as well. That's what Abraham was able to see. I'm always moved when I read verse 16. It says, "But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, he has prepared a city for them." Because as I read that, I'm reminded not only of the testimony of Abraham, but also of the testimonies of the saints I've had the privilege of walking alongside up to the time when the Lord called them home. You see, the characters highlighted in this passage, and the saints to whom I'm referring, had a faith that looks beyond death. It's a faith that looks not so much at the promises of God, but at the God who promises. It's the faith that enabled Abraham to get ready to sacrifice Isaac. It's the trust placed in the good purposes of God by my friend Kenny, who never ceased to pray for physical healing while here on earth, but who never took his eye off the God who would heal him for all eternity. Let's read verses 23 through 28. By faith Moses was hidden by his parents for 3 months after his birth, because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called a son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to share ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered abuse suffered for the Christ to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, unafraid of the king's anger, for he persevered as though he saw him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. The Bible narrative, or better put, God's story, is always pointing towards something infinitely better. And the writer to the Hebrews reminds us that people of faith keep their focus on the God who is telling a very long, deliberate, redemptive story. And now the letter gathers pace, and we're reminded of Moses, who, just like his forebear Abraham, gave up the comfort of what he currently enjoyed because he had his eyes fixed on the purposes of God. So much so that in Moses' case, he confronted the might of Egypt and instituted the first Passover and led God's people out of slavery. Verse 27 is very telling. It says that Moses persevered as one who saw him who is invisible. And I believe that's the key to living by faith for you and for me. That we would constantly hold before us the question, who or what am I focusing on? Let's conclude with verses 29 through 39. By faith the people passed through the Red Sea as if it were dry land. But when the Egyptians attempted to do so, they were drowned. By faith the walls of Jericho fell after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had received the spies in peace. And what more should I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received their dead by resurrection. Others were tortured, refusing to accept release in order to obtain a better resurrection. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned to death. They were sawn in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, persecuted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains, and in caves and holes in the ground. Yet all these, though they were commended for their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better, so that they would not, apart from us, be made perfect. The closing verses provide a catalogue that includes the miraculous, the messy, and the downright tragic. And it might pose for you and me the questions, why does it have to be that way? Why were, and indeed why are, people martyred for their faith? What does it all mean? Well, we're given a clue in verse 38. They were people of whom the world was not worthy. In other words, these people's God-focused lives often received scorn from the world. And yet, it was those very God-focused, Jesus-centered lives which were themselves and which are themselves signposts to God's new world and his eternal kingdom reality. The writer makes it very clear that these giants of faith didn't necessarily receive healing, deliverance, or freedom from persecution in the here and now, although some of them did. And he concludes the passage with an interesting phrase. They did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better, so that they would not, apart from us, be made perfect. I'd like you in your own time, if you will, to read through those verses. And two things strike me as we read through this who's who of heroes of the faith. Rahab, named as a prostitute, was clearly someone of dubious character, and yet here she is in this list of faith-filled people. We read of Gideon who had the visitation of the angel when he was hiding out from the Midianites, living in fear and trembling. And yet he's called out of his timidity to do mighty works for God. We think of Samson, again a person who was called to do God's work, to bring destruction upon the Philistines, and yet he himself displayed incredibly dubious character. And we think of David, the great king of Israel, but whose life was marked with some definite character imperfections, if you will. And then we read on, we think of Daniel as closing the mouths of lions, or having an angel do that on his behalf. We read of widows having their sons restored to them. That occurred both at the hands of Elisha and Elijah, and of course it happened when Jesus did the same for the widow at Nain. And for all of those success stories, if you will, we read about persecution, we read about martyrdom. And it is true that not everyone got to see the reality of God's goodness in the here and now. But as we read through this chapter, and as we rehearse these names, and I hope revisit them in their context in the Old Testament, I hope that if we hadn't realized it before now, it should make clear to each one of us that the purpose of the writer to the Hebrews telling the story in this way is so that you and I would come to an understanding that we are bound up ourselves in this incredible God story. As chapter 12 will go on to describe, God is building a community that has at its very center Jesus himself. And you and I are integral members of that community, along with Rahab and David and Gideon and Samuel and the rest. And in spite of our many imperfections, we are called to be beacons and signposts of God's perfect kingdom. That is what the Lord has called and continues to call us into. May we live into that kingdom reality. And even though we might only glimpse it now and again, might we be brave enough to ask the Holy Spirit to enable us, inspired by our forebears, to see that kingdom ever more clearly, so that we ourselves become beacons and signposts to that perfect kingdom. May it be so, Lord, in Jesus' name. Next week we're going to conclude our study of Hebrews by looking at chapters 12 and 13. But I would just encourage you, if you have the margin, if you have the time, to reread chapter 11 and to cross-reference some of the stories of the heroes and heroines of our faith, and to come to a better understanding that the long story that God is telling, starting back in the context of Hebrews chapter 11, with creation itself, and then going through Abel and Noah and Abraham and Moses, and fast forwarding to the disciples who were martyred. We are enfolded into that story. Let us not lose sight of that in the challenges that we face today. And we understand that each one of us faces various challenges, be it on a very personal level or be it on a more global, in a more global context. Let us never lose sight of the God who promises so much and has delivered so much in the person of Jesus Christ. Have a blessed week, and I look forward to concluding this story with you next week. I'll see you then.